A vast desert now covers the cradle of an ancient superpower. For thousands of years, the world's most iconic civilization not only survived here, but thrived with legendary abundance. Their secret was not gold or magic, but something far more fundamental and almost entirely forgotten. This is the mystery of lost Egyptian farming techniques. By the end of our journey, you will understand the ingenious systems that turned barren sand into the breadbasket of the ancient world. How did they master a river's rage to feed millions, and what profound agricultural wisdom vanished when their empire finally fell? What forgotten skill from our own time might one day seem just as miraculous? That river was their entire world. The Nile was not just a water source, it was the heartbeat of Egypt, a pulsing, life-giving force that dictated the rhythm of existence for every single person. Its behavior was the most reliable thing in their universe. Every single year, without fail, the summer rains far to the south in the highlands of Ethiopia would swell the river. By late summer, the Nile would rise, gently and predictably, spilling over its banks to blanket the valley in a shallow, nourishing flood. This was not a disaster, it was an annual blessing. As the waters slowly receded, they left behind a fresh, thick layer of the most fertile soil on Earth. A rich, dark silt the Egyptians called the Black Land, or Kemet. This was the literal ground of their civilization, a strip of incredible fertility, sometimes only a few miles wide, snaking through a landscape of utter desolation. Beyond that narrow, life-giving ribbon lay the Red Land, the endless, burning desert that represented death and chaos. Their entire agricultural genius, everything we find so mysterious and advanced, began with this simple, profound gift from the river. The Egyptian calendar itself was divided into 3 seasons based entirely on the Nile's cycle: Akhet, the inundation; Perit, the growing season when the land emerged from the water; and Shemu, the harvest time of drought. Their gods, their festivals, their very concept of order versus chaos, all stemmed from watching this river flood and retreat. So before we uncover any lost tools or forgotten canals, we must understand this foundation. The Egyptians were not fighting against nature to farm. They were masterfully cooperating with a natural cycle, so perfect it seemed divinely ordained. But what happened when the flood was too low, or catastrophically high? How did they move beyond simple reliance and start to engineer control over this great gift? That is where the true mystery of their farming technology begins. This mastery of the river's rhythm led to humanity's first large-scale irrigation system, a lost art of water management so elegant it feels almost modern. The Egyptians looked at the annual flood and asked a revolutionary question: what if we could trap it? Their answer was basin irrigation, a deceptively simple network that turned the entire Nile Valley into a vast, organized sponge. Before the floodwaters arrived, armies of farmers would build up massive earthen walls, levees that could stretch for miles, dividing the flat floodplain into a giant checkerboard of individual basins, each one perhaps the size of several modern football fields. These were not small garden plots, they were agricultural reservoirs. When the Nile rose, controlled openings in the levees, or canals dug from the river, would allow the silty water to pour into these giant, shallow bowls. They would let the basins fill, then seal them off, literally capturing the life-giving inundation and holding it prisoner. The water would sit for over a month, soaking deep into the parched earth, depositing its precious layer of mineral-rich silt and drowning any weeds or pests. Then, at just the right moment, they would open drains at the far end of the basin, letting the remaining water flow out to feed the next basin down the line or return to the receding river. What was left behind was a field perfectly prepared, deeply watered and fertilized, ready for planting, but the genius did not stop with the flood. Once the main inundation was gone, how did they keep their crops alive through the long, dry growing season? This is where another simple, forgotten tool comes in: the shaduf. Imagine a long pole balanced on a crossbeam, like a seesaw. On one end hung a counterweight, often a lump of dried mud or stone. On the other end, a bucket. A farmer could lower the bucket into a canal or a dug well, fill it, and with minimal effort thanks to the counterweight, lift and swing it to pour the water into the irrigation ditches feeding the fields. It was human-powered, relentless work, but it extended the reach of the river's gift by months. This entire system, the basins, the canals, the shaduf, represented a profound understanding of conservation. They were not wasting a single drop. They captured the flood's fertility, distributed its water with precision, and then manually supplemented it to perfection. It was a closed, sustainable loop that turned the unpredictable gift of a river into a guaranteed agricultural outcome. This is why Egypt could produce surplus harvests year after year, enough to feed the pharaoh's immense labor force building pyramids and temples. But what happened when the fields were ready, when the water was in place? The next mystery lies in what they chose to plant in that perfect black soil, and the revolutionary way they scheduled their entire year around not one, but multiple growing seasons. That shaduf was more than just a tool. It was a quiet revolution in human hands. Picture the scene along a sun-baked canal bank, long after the Great Flood has receded. The fields are a vibrant green, but the air is dry and hot. Here, the rhythmic creak of wood and the gentle splash of water would have been the soundtrack of survival. The device itself was a masterpiece of practical physics. A long wooden pole, often a trimmed tree trunk, was balanced on an upright frame. On one end hung a leather or clay bucket. On the other, a heavy counterweight of dried mud or stone, meticulously shaped to provide just the right balance. A farmer would pull down the bucket end, dunking it into the canal below. With a practiced push, the counterweight would do most of the work, lifting the full bucket effortlessly into the air. A simple swing of the pole would pour the water into a waiting irrigation ditch that fed a field sitting several feet higher than the river. This was the genius. The shaduf conquered gravity, lifting water from the low canals to the higher basins that the natural flood could no longer reach. It turned every stretch of riverbank and every hand dug well into a permanent water source. With this one simple machine, the Egyptians could farm land that was previously unusable, pushing the green edge of their civilization further and further into the desert margins. Its impact is almost impossible to overstate. A single shaduf, operated by one person, could irrigate about half an acre of land per day, but they were never used alone. You would see them in lines, a chain of these dipping and lifting arms, passing water up a gradual slope from the river to a distant field in a human-powered relay. This was scalable, sustainable technology. Made from local wood, rope, and mud, it required no metal, no complex parts, and could be repaired by anyone. This is why the shaduf did not just appear in the New Kingdom and vanish. It remained a cornerstone of Egyptian farming for over 3,000 years, a testament to a design so perfectly suited to its task that it needed no improvement. It gave individual farmers direct, personal control over the lifeblood of their crops. So while the great state-organized basin irrigation captured the annual bounty of the Nile, the humble shaduf represented the daily, persistent effort that truly made the desert bloom. But feeding a population in the millions required more than clever irrigation. It demanded a calendar of almost military precision and a hidden world of fertility, working silently beneath the black soil. Yet the shaduf's daily labor points to a deeper mystery. If farmers were manually lifting water long after the flood, could the Egyptians have engineered a more permanent solution, a way to make the river's gift last all year round? This leads us to the tantalizing possibility of perennial canals, a lost chapter in their agricultural mastery that moved beyond the simple, annual basin system. Most of the irrigation we've discussed was seasonal, tied directly to the Nile's flood pulse. But as the empire grew, especially during the prosperous New Kingdom, the demand for food would have skyrocketed. Supporting massive cities like Thebes, feeding the armies, and provisioning grand construction projects required more than one harvest per year. The logical leap was to create a constant, reliable water supply, independent of the flood's timing. This meant digging deeper, more sophisticated canals that could tap into the river's water table or divert its flow even during the dry season. Imagine a network of channels, carefully engineered with a gentle, consistent slope, lined with stone or compacted earth to prevent seepage, and maintained by teams of workers to keep them free of silt and debris. These would not be the temporary basins filled once a year, but permanent arteries carrying life into the fields 12 months a year. Such a system would have allowed for something revolutionary: multiple, staggered growing seasons. While one field was sown with emmer wheat after the flood, another, fed by a perennial canal, could be growing flax or vegetables, and a third might be yielding a second crop of barley. The land would never need to rest fallow, working in a continuous, productive cycle. So where is the evidence? The archaeological record is subtle but compelling. While the earthen banks of basin irrigation have largely vanished, traces of deeper, stone-lined canal beds have been found near major temple estates and royal agricultural centers. These are not the wide, shallow basins, but narrower, deeper channels designed for constant flow. Then there are the textual clues. Administrative papyri from the New Kingdom mention the careful distribution of water from the Great River to specific plots throughout the year, not just after the inundation. Tomb paintings sometimes show elaborate garden scenes with permanent pools and channels, suggesting the technology for sustained irrigation existed, at least for the elite. The most compelling hint might be in the crops themselves. We know the Egyptians cultivated certain vegetables and fruits that required constant moisture. How did they keep orchards of date palms and fig trees alive through the blistering summer without a constant water source? The humble shaduf could do it, but only with immense, relentless labor. A perennial canal system makes this level of sophisticated horticulture not only possible, but efficient. This suggests their knowledge of hydrology, of controlling water flow, and managing silt over vast distances was far more advanced than we typically credit. It wasn't just about capturing the flood, it was about bending the river's very rhythm to a human calendar. The real question then becomes, if this knowledge was so advanced, why did it seemingly disappear? The answer may lie not in a single forgotten blueprint, but in the slow collapse of the very society that maintained it. But controlling water was only half the battle. To plant a kingdom's worth of grain in that perfect, moist silt, the Egyptians needed a tool to prepare the earth, a device so fundamental it became a symbol of life itself, the plow. This was not the heavy, deep-cutting iron plow of medieval Europe. Theirs was the ard, a brilliant adaptation to their unique environment. Picture a long, forked wooden beam. One end was shaped into a pointed share, often just fire-hardened wood or later tipped with a small copper blade. The other end was attached to a pair of oxen by a simple yoke. A farmer would guide the handles, pressing the share into the soil. It did not turn the earth over in great furrows. Instead, it scratched a shallow groove, just deep enough to break the sun-baked crust and create a narrow trench for seeds. This was perfect for the Nile's gift. The fertile black silt was light and soft after the flood, needing only gentle disruption. Deep plowing would have been disastrous, bringing up the barren, saline subsoil and killing the delicate balance of moisture the basin irrigation so carefully preserved. The ard was a tool of conservation, working in harmony with the land's natural state. Its use was a communal symphony. Tomb paintings from nobles' burial chambers vividly show this sacred act. You see two strong oxen, their hides patterned, moving steadily forward. A farmer leans into the wooden handles, guiding the share. Often, a second person walks alongside, urging the animals on with a stick. Sometimes a third follows, scattering seeds from a basket into the freshly opened groove. It was a family or community effort, a rhythmic, physical connection to the earth that fed everyone. This scene was important enough to be painted for eternity, a testament to how central this simple tool was to their survival and their identity. Over 3,000 years, could this design have been refined in ways we have lost? The basic form remained constant, a testament to its perfect suitability, but we might speculate on subtle improvements. The choice of wood, perhaps a specific acacia for its strength and flexibility. The shape of the share, gradually optimized to reduce drag. The harnessing techniques, adjusting the yoke to distribute the oxen's pull more efficiently and prevent injury. These are not grand inventions, but generations of accumulated, silent wisdom, the kind of knowledge passed from father to son on the field, not written in any manual. The true sophistication was not in the plow itself, but in the orchestration of its use. Timing was everything. They had to wait for the floodwaters to fully recede and the soil to reach the precise state between wet mud and dry brick. that perfect tilth. Then, across the kingdom, in a wave following the river's retreat, the scratching of countless ards would begin, a sound that signaled the start of another season of life. This simple wooden scratch plow, pulled by patient oxen, was the machine that literally laid the groundwork for pyramids and temples. It transformed captured water and fertile silt into a planted promise. But once the seeds were in that perfect groove, another hidden world of natural allies went to work beneath the surface. The plow's shallow groove was a perfect cradle, but the seed within it held the future. Sowing was not a haphazard scattering, it was a deliberate ritual, a partnership between human hands and the rhythm of the earth. Often, the farmer guiding the oxen was followed immediately by a sower, walking steadily and casting handfuls of grain directly into the freshly opened furrow. This created a seamless, efficient line of work, one action flowing into the next, but the process didn't end with the plow and the sower. In some fields, a final, living tool was employed. After the seeds were cast, a small flock of sheep might be driven back and forth across the soft soil. Their sharp, delicate hooves served a brilliant purpose, gently treading the seeds into the moist silt, pressing them to just the right depth for germination, and protecting them from being eaten by birds or baked dry by the sun. This was a practical, zero-waste solution, using animals already integral to the farm to finish the job. This act of planting was deeply sacred, woven into the very fabric of Egyptian time. It coincided with the festival of Perit, the going forth season, when the land emerged from the floodwaters. Sowing was seen as a reenactment of the god Osiris's resurrection, the seed buried in the dark earth symbolizing death, with the promise of green life to come. Farmers likely recited prayers or chants as they worked, invoking gods of fertility and growth like Osiris and Min. The calendar dictated the timing with absolute authority. Miss the narrow window after the flood receded, and the soil would turn to dust, the precious moisture lost. This wasn't just agriculture, it was a cosmic duty, aligning human labor with the cycles of the gods and the river. The primary actors in this annual drama were two sturdy grains, emmer wheat and barley. Emmer, a predecessor to modern wheat, was prized for its robust nature and used for the daily bread that was the true currency of life. Barley, slightly more tolerant of saline soil, was the backbone of beer, another dietary staple. But what of the subtler arts of planting, the kind of knowledge never chiseled into stone? We have no surviving farmer's almanac detailing seed spacing or soil companions. This was the realm of oral tradition, wisdom passed from generation to generation in the fields. The seasoned farmer would know by sight and feel how thickly to sow each basin, judging by the depth of the silt left by that particular year's flood. He might have understood, through centuries of trial and error, that planting flax near the emmer could help deter certain pests, or that legumes, if rotated in, could mysteriously restore strength to the soil. This intimate, localized knowledge, the true fingerprint of their agricultural genius, is almost entirely lost to us. It vanished not with a conquest, but with the last whisper of that oral tradition, leaving us to wonder what profound efficiencies were achieved not by grand canals, but by the careful placement of one seed next to another. That intimate knowledge of seeds was part of a larger cosmic clockwork. The Egyptian farmer did not simply watch the river, he watched the sky. His entire year, his very livelihood, was governed by a sacred, three-part cycle so perfectly aligned with the heavens it feels like a divine instruction manual. The seasons were not vague notions of spring or fall, but precise, actionable phases named after the land's relationship with the Nile. Akhit was the inundation, the time of flood when the black land vanished beneath the life-giving water. Perit was the emergence, when the waters receded and the land, fertile and ready, went forth for planting. Shemu was the harvest, the time of drought and heat when the crops were cut and the earth baked under the relentless sun. But how did they know when Akhit was coming? The answer is written in the stars. The most critical celestial event of their year was the heliacal rising of Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. After a period of invisibility, Sirius would reappear just before dawn in the eastern horizon. This always occurred in mid-July, and with astonishing reliability, within a few weeks of this stellar reappearance, the Nile would begin its rise. To the Egyptians, this was no coincidence. Sirius, which they called Sopdet, was a goddess whose return literally pulled the flood from the river's source. This connection between a star and a terrestrial event is one of the earliest and most precise examples of astronomical knowledge being applied directly to human survival. The calendar was thus a unisolar masterpiece, constantly tweaked to keep the star's signal aligned with the river's behavior. Yet the stars gave only the general signal. The actual success or failure of a harvest depended on the flood's character. Was it a good Nile, rising high enough to fill all the basins, but not so high it breached the levees and destroyed villages? Or was it a low Nile, leaving vast tracts of land dry and doomed to famine? This is where we encounter the deepest layer of lost knowledge. Generations of farmers must have possessed an incredibly nuanced understanding of environmental cues long before the official flood gauges, the Nilometers, recorded the height. They would have watched for subtle signs. The color of the water as it first arrived, carrying different silt from different tributaries, might have indicated its source and potential strength. The behavior of animals, perhaps the nesting patterns of birds along the riverbank or the agitation of certain fish, could have been read as prophecies. The taste of the well water or the specific timing of certain desert winds might have held meaning. This was a science of observation passed down not in temples, but in homes and fields, a continuous, unbroken chain of lived experience that allowed a community to prepare, to ration, to plant certain resilient crops in anticipation of a lean year. A farmer could likely look at the riverbank at a specific time, smell the air, and feel in his bones what kind of year it would be. This profound, localized wisdom, this dialogue with a living landscape, is almost entirely silent in the archaeological record. We have the grand calendar, we have the Nilometer measurements, but the quiet, daily act of reading the river's mood is a language we can no longer understand. It vanished when the last farmer who learned it from his grandfather took that knowledge with him, leaving us with the skeleton of their system, but not its soul. This deep time awareness raises a haunting question for our own era. The rhythm of the stars and the river created the time to plant, but the soil itself demanded its own kind of respect. To feed a civilization for millennia on the same narrow strip of land, the Egyptians had to solve a puzzle we still grapple with today. How do you keep the earth from becoming exhausted? Their answer was not in a bag of chemical fertilizer, but in a quiet, cyclical wisdom of giving back. While we have no surviving agricultural textbooks, the evidence points to a system of crop rotation and fallowing so elegantly simple, it was almost invisible. The most basic practice was likely a two-field system. In a given basin, one year they would sow their staple grains, emmer wheat and barley. The following year, that same field might be planted with legumes like lentils, fava beans, or chickpeas, or it might be left completely fallow, resting under the sun. This was not random. They may not have known the word nitrogen, but through endless seasons of observation, they understood that after beans were harvested, the soil seemed stronger, more vibrant for the next planting of grain. We now know the science they intuited. Legumes host bacteria in their roots that pull nitrogen from the air and fix it into the soil, a natural fertilizer factory working silently below the surface. Letting a field lie fallow served a different purpose. It was a reset, with no crops drawing nutrients, and with the annual flood still depositing its fresh silt, the land could recover its vitality. It also helped control weeds and pests by breaking their life cycles, but could their system have been more sophisticated? Some researchers speculate about lost practices of green manure, where a fast-growing crop like clover or certain grasses was planted not for harvest, but to be plowed directly back into the soil while still green, decomposing to enrich the earth. Tomb paintings occasionally show dense, low-growing plants in fields that are not immediately identifiable as a food crop. Were these cover crops a deliberate strategy to protect the soil from erosion and add organic matter? It is a tantalizing possibility. The true genius was in the scale and patience of this practice. This was not a single farmer's experiment, but a cultural tradition woven into the fabric of agricultural life. The decision of what to plant where each year would have been a community calculation, balancing the hunger of the granaries with the long-term health of the land. They were thinking in decades and centuries, not just seasons. This empirical science born from countless hands in the earth, created a sustainable loop. The river brought new silt, the legumes restored nitrogen, the fallow periods allowed recovery. It was a partnership with nature that asked for as much as it took. In an age before soil science, they listened to the land and understood its needs. This deep, cyclical respect for fertility may be the most profound farming technique they ever mastered, and its quiet disappearance leaves us with a pressing question. What other dialogues with the natural world have we forgotten how to hear? But that wisdom of the soil extended far beyond the fields of grain. To truly grasp the Egyptians' mastery, you must look to their lost orchards, to the shaded groves where they cultivated sweetness and luxury with a sophistication that rivals modern horticulture. While emmer wheat filled the granaries, it was fruits like dates, figs, grapes, and pomegranates that nourished the soul and displayed their deepest agricultural artistry. These were not wild plants casually tended. They were the products of deliberate, advanced cultivation within carefully managed spaces, often walled gardens that were microcosms of control in the desert climate. Consider the date palm. Its fruit was a staple sweetener, its wood was used for building, and its leaves for weaving. But the date palm has a secret. It comes in male and female trees, and only the female produces fruit. To ensure a reliable harvest, the Egyptians practiced artificial pollination, a technique depicted in tomb reliefs. A worker would climb a male palm, collect its pollen-laden flowers, and then carefully dust that pollen onto the flowers of a female tree. This was a conscious manipulation of nature's process, an early form of biotechnology applied centuries before the science was understood. It guaranteed abundance, turning a chance of nature into a certainty of human design. Then there were the vineyards. Growing grapes for wine in the blazing Egyptian sun required another layer of innovation. Tomb paintings show vines trained on trellises, their leafy canopies creating dappled shade for the ripening clusters below. This was not just for support. By lifting the vines, they improved air circulation to prevent rot, positioned the fruit for optimal sun exposure, and made the arduous work of harvesting and pruning infinitely easier. These trellises represent a fundamental understanding of plant physiology, of guiding growth for both the health of the plant and the convenience of the farmer. The gardens themselves were feats of hydraulic engineering. A noble's walled garden, often depicted as a paradise in tomb art, was a complex irrigation machine. A central pond, fed by a canal from the Nile or a deep well worked by a shaduf, acted as a reservoir. From this pond, a network of narrow channels, sometimes lined with baked clay tiles, carried water directly to the base of each precious tree and vine. This was drip irrigation on a Bronze Age scale, a targeted delivery system that conserved every drop and gave each plant exactly what it needed. The walls served a vital purpose beyond marking property. They were windbreaks, shielding delicate blossoms from scorching desert winds, and they created a microclimate, trapping slightly cooler, more humid air within the enclosure. Within these protected oases, they grew sycamore figs, not primarily for fruit, but for their dense, welcome shade in courtyards and along roads. They cultivated pomegranates, with their leathery skin perfectly adapted to storage, and true figs, which may have been pruned and shaped to increase yield. And this is where we enter the realm of the truly lost. We see the results, the trellises, and the irrigation channels, in art. But what of the silent knowledge that never made it into a painting? How did they prune a grapevine to maximize fruit production? What secret grafts did they perfect, joining the branch of a superior fig tree to the hardy rootstock of a wild one? How did they manage pests without modern chemicals? Perhaps they introduced certain birds to eat insects, or planted aromatic herbs as natural repellents. A papyrus might mention a keeper of the vineyards, a title that implies a specialized custodian of arcane, valuable knowledge. The success of these orchards and gardens tells us their understanding was profound. It was a hands-on science of life, a dialogue with each individual plant species. This was agriculture raised to an art form, where food became culture, and cultivation became a testament to human patience and ingenuity. The loss of this intimate, species-specific wisdom is perhaps even more poignant than the fading memory of the Great Basin systems. It represents a forgotten conversation with the living world, a language of growth we are still struggling to relearn. The silent conversation with plants was mirrored by a living, breathing partnership with animals, an unseen workforce that powered the entire agricultural machine. Beyond the oxen that pulled the plow, a whole ecology of domesticated creatures was woven into the fabric of Egyptian farming, each with a specific, irreplaceable role. The mighty ox was the prime mover. These were not just any cattle, but animals selectively bred over generations for strength, patience, and a calm temperament suited to the slow, steady work of dragging the yard through the silt. Their care was paramount. During the inundation, when fields were underwater, they would be moved to higher ground, fed on stored hay and the lush grasses that sprang up on the delta's fringes. A well-treated ox was a family's most valuable asset, a living engine of production. Then there was the donkey, the unsung hero of logistics. With a capacity to carry heavy loads over long distances in blistering heat on minimal water, donkeys were the trucks of the ancient world. They transported harvested grain from remote basins to central threshing floors and granaries. They carried tools, seed, and fertilizer. They moved the families of seasonal workers. Without the humble donkey's endurance, the distribution of food across a long, narrow kingdom would have been impossible. Smaller livestock, sheep and goats, provided a more immediate yield. They were walking larders, sources of meat, milk, and wool. But their most ingenious contribution to farming happened right in the field. As we saw with sowing, flocks were often driven over freshly seeded earth to tread the seeds in. But this was a dual-purpose act. As the animals moved, they also fertilized the land, their droppings adding a direct, nutrient-rich boost to the soil. This points to a profound, lost understanding of closed-loop systems. Animal dung was not waste. It was a recognized resource, collected from pens and likely composted with straw and other organic matter to create a potent, natural fertilizer that was returned to the fields. This created a beautiful cycle. The animals ate the byproducts of the harvest, like straw and damaged grain, and in return, their manure helped grow the next harvest. The management of these animals required deep, seasonal wisdom. The Delta marshes and the desert's edge were not barren wastelands, but vital seasonal pastures. Herders knew exactly when certain grasses would sprout after a slight rainfall or as the flood receded, moving their flocks in an annual migratory dance to these green patches. This knowledge of marginal ecosystems, of where and when the land could support life without irrigation, is another layer of silent geography that has faded away. What did they know about animal nutrition that we don't? Which native plants, now considered weeds, did they deliberately allow to grow as fodder? How did they treat common ailments without modern veterinary medicine, using local herbs and clays? This was a hands-on science of husbandry, a daily reading of an animal's health and needs, ensuring the workforce remained strong. The entire farm, therefore, was not just a plot of land, but an interconnected web. The oxen plowed, the donkeys transported, the sheep fertilized, and all were sustained by the land they helped cultivate. This holistic view, where every element had a purpose and nothing was wasted, may be the most sophisticated technique of all. It raises a quiet challenge to our own era of separation, where fields, animals, and waste are often disconnected. What have we lost by forgetting that a farm is not a factory, but a living, breathing community? This holistic web of farms, animals, and orchards required a command center, a place where the river's power could be harnessed on an almost unimaginable scale. For the ultimate case study in lost hydraulic engineering, we must travel to the Fayum. This vast desert depression, lying west of the Nile, became the ancient world's most ambitious agricultural experiment. It was here, under the visionary pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom like Amenemhat I and his descendant Amenemhat III, that Egyptian water management reached its zenith. Their project was staggering. They looked at the seasonal overflow of the Nile into a natural basin called Lake Moeris and asked a revolutionary question: what if we could control that? Not just trap it in basins, but permanently redirect the river's very course into the desert. The result was a feat of engineering that feels modern. They constructed a massive diversion canal, later known as the Bar Yusuf, which split off from the Nile near the modern city of Asiyut. This was not a small irrigation ditch. This was a man-made river, engineered to flow for over 200 miles, carrying a portion of the Nile's annual flood westward into the Fayum Depression. The goal was to dramatically expand the existing Lake Moeris, turning it into a giant, regulated reservoir the size of a small sea. But the genius did not stop at the lake's edge. From this newly expanded reservoir, they engineered a second, even more intricate network of smaller canals and dikes that spread out like the veins on a leaf, distributing the captured water across hundreds of square miles of previously barren desert floor. They essentially created an artificial delta, a second Nile Valley in miniature, entirely by human design. The scale of earth moving, the precision of the gradients needed to keep water flowing over such distances without stagnating or eroding the channels, represents a lost science of practical hydraulics. This was mathematics made manifest in mud and stone. The payoff was monumental. The Fayum was transformed into the empire's most prolific breadbasket, a lush garden of grain fields, olive groves, and vineyards that could produce surplus harvests year after year, insulating the kingdom from famine. It was a triumph of long-term thinking, a project that took generations to complete. Yet, this is where the mystery of lost knowledge becomes acute. When the central authority of the Middle Kingdom eventually faded, the maintenance of this colossal system faltered. The specific, localized knowledge required to keep it functioning began to dissolve. Which canal segment needed dredging first after a low flood? How did you adjust the flow gates when the silt load was particularly heavy? Which dike was most vulnerable to a specific type of erosion? This was not knowledge written in a manual. It was carried in the minds of the engineers and overseers who walked those canals every year. As political will and resources waned, the lakes slowly shrank, the canals silted up, and the desert began to reclaim its territory. The Fayum did not disappear, but the supreme, orchestrated control over it did. The specific blueprints for managing that entire hydraulic organism, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of fine-tuning, faded into the sand. It stands as a powerful testament to a profound truth. Their greatest technologies were not just physical constructions, but living systems of knowledge, and when the society that nurtured them changed, that knowledge could evaporate like water under the desert sun. The grand hydraulic systems of the Fayum fed a kingdom, but the final act of that miracle happened under the blazing sun, with simple tools in calloused hands. Harvest time, or shemu, was a race against heat and hunger. The fields of golden emmer and barley stood ready, and the entire community mobilized. The primary tool for reaping was the sickle, a curved blade that is deceptively humble in appearance. Early on, these were not made of metal, but of sharpened flint blades set into a wooden handle and secured with resin or leather cord. Even after copper became more common, the design remained elegantly simple. A farmer or laborer, often working in a line with others, would grasp a handful of stalks with one hand and sweep the sickle's curved blade at the base with the other, cutting with a pulling motion. The sound would have been a constant, rhythmic swish across the valley, a chorus of severing stems. They did not cut the grain too low. They left a significant stubble in the field, which served a vital purpose later. The cut stalks were gathered into sheaves and tied, ready for the next critical step, but the grain was still locked inside its tough, protective husk. To free it, the Egyptians employed a brilliant, almost brutal method, the threshing sledge. This was not a gentle tool. Imagine a heavy wooden board, perhaps 6 feet long, with a curved front like a sled. Embedded into its underside were dozens of sharp flakes of chert or flint. This fearsome device was then hitched to a pair of oxen. The driver would stand or sit on the sledge for added weight, and the oxen would be driven in endless, tight circles over the piles of harvested stalks, spread across a hard-packed, outdoor threshing floor. As the sledge dragged over the grain, the embedded stone teeth acted like thousands of tiny knives, crushing and slicing the stalks to separate the precious kernels from the chaff. It was efficient, relentless, and noisy. The resulting mixture of grain, broken straw, and husks then required separation, a process that relied on the simplest force of all, the wind. This was winnowing. Using wide, shallow baskets or wooden forks, workers would toss the threshed mixture into the air. The constant breezes that swept the Nile Valley, especially in the dry harvest season, would carry away the lighter chaff and straw. while the heavier grain kernels would fall back to the ground in a clean pile. It was physics as a farm tool, a beautiful dance of observation and utility, but this bounty was perishable. A successful harvest meant nothing if the grain spoiled, was eaten by pests, or could not be distributed. This is where the scale of Egyptian organization becomes truly awe-inspiring in the granary. These were not just simple storage pits. At the local level, a village might have mud brick silos, shaped like giant beehives, plastered smooth to keep out rodents and insects. But the state-run granaries were logistical marvels. Attached to temples and royal palaces, they were vast complexes of long, rectangular mud brick rooms with vaulted ceilings, often raised on platforms to stay cool and dry. Administrative papyri show these were run with meticulous bureaucracy. Scribes would record every sack of grain entering, noting its source, quality, and the farmer who delivered it as a form of tax. The grain was poured into these large rooms through openings in the roof, and then shoveled out through smaller, ground-level doors when needed for ration distribution, to feed workers, or for trade. The knowledge required to manage these vast storehouses is a lost science in itself. How did they monitor temperature and humidity in those thick-walled rooms to prevent mold and spontaneous combustion? They likely had systems of ventilation shafts designed to catch the prevailing wind. They would have used specific types of clean, dry sand or ash layered with the grain to deter insects. The precise ratios, the timing of turning the grain to prevent heating, the herbal repellents they might have used. These were the daily practices of the granary keeper, a specialized profession whose empirical wisdom is almost entirely lost to us. The distribution network from these central hubs was the true circulatory system of the state, ensuring that a worker at a remote quarry or a soldier on the frontier received his daily bread. The loss of this granular, logistical knowledge, the silent hum of a perfectly managed supply chain, may have been as catastrophic to their later society as any drought or invasion. It was the quiet collapse of the system behind the system, leaving granaries full but knowledge empty. That carefully stored grain was never meant to sit idle in a granary. It had a singular, urgent purpose, to be transformed into the two substances that literally built Egypt, bread and beer. These were not mere food and drink. They were the fundamental units of energy, the currency of labor, and the very fabric of daily life. Every loaf and every jar represented the final, miraculous step in the agricultural chain, a process that turned hard-won emmer wheat and barley into the fuel of a civilization. The journey from kernel to bread began in the home, with a tool so ancient and simple it seems almost brutal, the saddle quern. Picture two heavy stones. The lower one, the quern, was slightly concave, like a shallow stone bowl set into the floor. The upper stone, the handstone, was a smooth, elongated rock. A woman, for this was overwhelmingly women's work, would kneel before it, taking a handful of grain and spreading it on the lower stone. Then, with a rhythmic, rocking motion, she would grind the handstone back and forth, crushing the tough emmer wheat kernels into a coarse, wholemeal flour. This was not a quick task. It was hours of relentless, physical labor each day just to produce enough flour to feed a family. The sound of grinding stones was the dawn chorus of Egyptian households, a gritty, monotonous music of survival. The flour, mixed with water and a bit of sourdough from the previous batch, became a thick dough. But baking this dough required another ingenious, lost piece of household technology. They did not have the clay ovens we might imagine. Instead, they used conical, preheated pottery molds. The dough would be slapped onto the hot, inverted exterior surface of these molds, where it would quickly bake into a loaf. The result was not a soft, fluffy bread, but a dense, nutritious disc with a distinctive shape, often found in tomb offerings. The sheer volume of this daily, decentralized production is staggering to contemplate. In every village, in every home, this exacting process was repeated. A vast, silent network of micro-industry, powered by generations of accumulated, unwritten knowledge. How much water for this year's grain, which felt slightly drier? How long to let the dough ferment on a particularly hot day? Which wild yeast from the air gave the best rise? This was a science of the senses, passed from mother to daughter. a universe of practical wisdom that vanished with the smoke from a million daily fires. If bread was the solid staple, beer was its liquid twin, the other indispensable pillar of the diet. But Egyptian beer was not like the clear, hopped beverage we know today. It was a thick, nutritious, porridge-like drink, relatively low in alcohol but packed with calories and vitamins. Its primary ingredient was barley, and its production method was a fascinating hybrid of baking and brewing, centered on a special ingredient called bapir, or beer bread. To make it, barley dough was lightly baked into large, flat, crumbly loaves that were deliberately undercooked. This bapir was then broken into pieces and mixed with water in large vats. Natural yeasts, either from the air or from residues left in the vats, would begin a wild fermentation, turning the sugary mixture into beer. Sometimes, for sweetness and extra fermentation, dates were added. The mixture was then strained through a sieve into jars, ready for consumption. This beer was consumed by everyone, from the pharaoh to the youngest laborer. It was safer than Nile water, which could carry parasites, and it provided essential nutrients. Workers on state projects like pyramid building received a daily ration of bread and beer as their wage. This direct link is profound. The entire monumental architecture of Egypt was quite literally built on barley and emmer wheat. The knowledge of brewing, like baking, was a deeply held domestic craft. The perfect point to stop baking the bapir so it would crumble correctly, the ideal temperature for the fermentation vats, the telltale smell of a successful brew. These were intimate skills. While large-scale production existed for temples and the state, the heart of the knowledge lived in households, often overseen by women who were the keepers of this vital alchemy. The loss here is not of grand engineering, but of a million tiny perfections. We know they made bread and beer. We have the grinding stones and the beer jars. But we have lost the living recipes, the nuanced adjustments, the secret touches that turned staple grains into a culture's defining flavors. This was the true culmination of their farming genius, not just growing grain, but mastering the intimate, daily magic of transforming it into life itself. Bread and beer were more than sustenance, they were the physical currency of the state. This entire agricultural miracle, from the shaduf to the granary, did not happen by accident. It was orchestrated at the highest level by a sophisticated, almost modern bureaucracy that turned farming into a national engine. At the top stood the pharaoh, but not just as a king. He was the ultimate landlord, the living embodiment of the god who guaranteed the Nile's flood. Vast tracts of the most fertile land, especially in the Delta and the Fayum, were crown lands owned directly by the royal house. Equally massive were the temple estates, granted by the pharaoh to support the cults of major gods like Ammon or Osiris. These were not just places of worship. They were immense, self-contained agricultural corporations with their own fields, laborers, herds, and storage facilities. The surplus they generated funded everything from temple rituals to monumental construction. But how did the state know what it owned, and more importantly, what it could tax? This required an annual ritual as important as the flood itself, the survey. After the waters receded and the fields were visible again, teams of royal scribes and surveyors, armed with measuring ropes knotted at precise intervals, would fan out across the black land. They did not just measure area. They assessed the quality of the silt deposited, noted which basins had received enough water, and calculated an expected yield for every single plot. This was data collection on a Bronze Age scale. Their calculations, recorded on papyrus scrolls, determined the tax burden for every farmer and every estate. A portion of the expected harvest, often as high as 1/5, was owed to the state. This grain was the lifeblood of the kingdom, funding the army, the bureaucracy, and the thousands of laborers not tied to the land. To collect and manage this river of grain, Egypt developed a bureaucracy of astonishing complexity. An army of scribes tracked every transaction, from the field to the granary door. Overseers managed the work gangs who maintained canals and dikes. Accountants balanced the books of entire provinces. This was a system built on trust in written records and mathematical precision, a system that could forecast the kingdom's food supply a year in advance. But this machine required more than just grain, it required human power. This is where the corvée labor system comes in. Every year, for a set period, every able-bodied Egyptian farmer owed the state a tax paid not in grain, but in labor. When the floodwaters covered their fields and farming work was impossible, they were conscripted into national service. This was the workforce that built the pyramids, yes, but more importantly for our story, it was the workforce that dug and dredged the great canals, repaired the massive levees, and maintained the hydraulic heart of the nation. It was a rotating, seasonal army of engineers and diggers, mobilized with breathtaking efficiency. The knowledge to direct this force, however, is where we find a profound vulnerability. The organizational techniques required to feed, house, and deploy tens of thousands of men on projects like the Fayum diversion were a form of social technology as advanced as any irrigation canal. Which overseer knew how to motivate a work gang in the brutal summer heat? Which scribe had the logistical genius to schedule the dredging of 100 miles of canals in the correct sequence? This was management wisdom passed down through experience within the bureaucracy itself. When the central state grew weak, when pharaohs lost control, and the bureaucracy fragmented, this large-scale organizational knowledge didn't just get written down in a manual and filed away. It evaporated. The specific, practiced rhythm of coordinating thousands of hands to serve a single hydraulic purpose simply ceased to exist. A society might remember how to build a shaduf, but forgetting how to mobilize a nation to care for its rivers was a far greater loss. This collapse of the managerial mind may have been the final, quiet undoing of their agricultural empire, leaving the physical tools intact, but scattering the collective intelligence needed to wield them on a civilization scale. Yet the state's vast grain machine fed the body, while another, more delicate form of agriculture nourished the spirit and displayed the pinnacle of Egyptian luxury, the elite pleasure garden. For the nobility and the pharaoh, farming was not merely a matter of survival. It was an art form, a way to sculpt nature into a living paradise. These were not the expansive fields of emmer wheat, but intimate, walled sanctuaries of shade, scent, and stunning beauty, where horticultural knowledge reached its most refined and, ultimately, most fragile expression. Step through the gateway of a noble's estate, and you would leave the dusty, sun-baked world behind. Inside, a meticulously ordered universe unfolded. Straight, shaded walkways, often lined with rows of date palms or sycamore figs, created cool corridors. At the heart of the garden, you would almost always find a central, ornamental pond, a glittering rectangle of life-giving water. But this pool was not just for beauty. It was the hydraulic heart of the entire garden, and its shape holds a key to their ingenuity. Archaeologists and tomb paintings reveal a distinctive T-shaped design. The main body of the pool was long and rectangular, but a perpendicular channel extended from its center, creating the T. This was a masterpiece of dual-purpose design. Aesthetically, it created interesting reflections and visual lines. Practically, it was an irrigation control hub. Water, lifted by shaduf from a well or canal, would fill the main pool. From there, the gardener could open simple clay or wooden sluices at the head of the T channel, directing water into narrower subsidiary channels that ran along the base of every tree row and flower bed. This was targeted, gravity-fed irrigation on a miniature scale, ensuring every precious plant received its share without wasting a drop. The pond itself teemed with life, stocked with fish like tilapia and adorned with floating lotus blossoms, their blue and white flowers sacred symbols of rebirth. The air would have been thick with the hum of bees and the perfume of flowers, a sensory escape manufactured in the desert. The true test of their skill, however, was not in watering plants, but in moving them. To create an instant paradise, Egyptian gardeners didn't wait for saplings to grow. Tomb inscriptions boast of transplanting full-grown trees, a staggering feat. Imagine the logistics of digging up a mature, fruit-bearing date palm with its vast root ball, transporting it miles by barge and donkey cart without it drying out, and successfully replanting it in a new garden where it would continue to thrive. This implies a lost science of root pruning, soil preparation, and aftercare that we can only guess at. They were effectively creating instant landscapes, manipulating mature nature to suit their aesthetic vision overnight. These walled gardens were also masterclasses in microclimate engineering. The high walls shielded delicate plants from scorching winds and reduced evaporation. The shade from tall trees cooled the air, while the evaporating water from the central pond raised humidity, creating a pocket of climate utterly different from the surrounding desert. Within this manufactured Eden, they cultivated for purposes beyond food. The lotus was everywhere, not just in ponds but in garden beds. Its roots, stems, and flowers used in religious ceremonies, perfumes, and art. They grew the mysterious mandrake, with its forked root resembling a human form, prized as a potent medicinal and ritual plant. They raised beds of cornflowers, poppies, and chrysanthemums for garlands and decoration. This was botany as a high art, a fusion of spiritual symbolism, medical knowledge, and pure aesthetic delight. The head gardener of a great estate was a master of many sciences: hydraulics, arboriculture, soil chemistry, and even a form of early pharmacology. His knowledge was specific, precious, and almost entirely oral, passed down through apprenticeships within elite households. When those households fell, when the palaces were abandoned and the walls crumbled, this rarefied world of scent and shade was among the first to vanish. The delicate balance of the T-shaped pool silted up, the imported trees withered, and the secrets of transplanting a mature tamarisk died with the last gardener who knew the trick. We are left with the paintings on tomb walls, beautiful but silent, showing us the paradise without revealing the whispered instructions that kept it alive. The serenity of those walled gardens belies a constant, hidden war waged in the fields. For every stalk of grain the Egyptians nurtured, a legion of hungry mouths waited to devour it. Their battle against pests was fought not with synthetic chemicals, but with a deep, intuitive understanding of the natural world, blending razor-sharp observation with a profound spiritual pact. The threats were relentless. Swarms of locusts could descend like a living storm, stripping a field bare in hours. Flocks of quail and other grain-eating birds followed the harvest like a shadow. Below the soil, mice and insects gnawed at roots and stores. Their solutions were as practical as they were ingenious. Against birds, they deployed nets. Tomb paintings show laborers stretching large, finely woven nets over newly sown fields or recently harvested grain spread on threshing floors. This was a physical, labor-intensive barrier, a communal effort to literally throw a veil over their bounty. For rodents, they enlisted a living ally, the cat. While the sacred status of cats is well known, their original, practical value was as supreme hunters of mice and snakes that threatened grain stores. A farm with several cats was a protected farm, a biological security system that patrolled silently in the night. But their pest management almost certainly extended into more subtle, botanical warfare, a realm of lost knowledge we can only reconstruct from fragments. They would have observed, over generations, that certain strong-smelling plants seemed to deter specific insects. Perhaps they interplanted rows of grain with pungent herbs like mint, rue, or wormwood. The sharp scent of these plants, carried on the breeze, could create an aromatic shield, confusing or repelling pests without harming the crop or the soil. They may have used traps baited with spoiled fruit to lure and drown beetles, or introduced beneficial predators like certain wasps that parasitize crop-eating caterpillars. This was an integrated system, a constant, quiet dialogue with the farm's entire ecosystem. Yet, for the Egyptians, a locust swarm was never just a biological event. It was a potential manifestation of divine displeasure, a breach in the sacred order of Ma'at. This is where practical knowledge intertwined seamlessly with spiritual practice. To protect the harvest, they appealed directly to its divine guardian, the goddess Renenutet. Often depicted as a cobra or a woman with a serpent's head, Renenutet was not a menacing figure, but a nurturing one. She was the spirit of the fertile fields and the granary, a deity who ensured the growth of crops and guarded them against blight and pests. Farmers would leave small offerings at the edges of their fields, perhaps a bit of bread or beer, to gain her favor. During key moments in the growing season, there were likely rituals and prayers spoken in her name, communal chants or processions that served a dual purpose. On one level, they were a spiritual plea for protection. On another, they were a powerful social tool, uniting the entire community in a shared purpose, and reinforcing the collective responsibility for the crop's safety. Everyone watching for the first sign of trouble became an extension of Renenutet's watchful gaze. The true depth of their lost knowledge lies in this fusion. A farmer noticing that ants avoided a patch of land where a particular weed grew might have taken that as a practical sign and a whisper from the goddess. The decision to plant marigolds near the vegetables wasn't just horticulture. It was an act of co-creation with the divine principles of the natural world. The communal scarecrow, a figure perhaps dressed in old linens, was both a practical bird deterrent and a kind of field guardian, imbued with symbolic power. This holistic view meant pest management was never a separate task, but a thread woven into the fabric of daily farming life, spiritual observance, and community identity. When we reduce their methods to just nets and cats, we miss the symphony. We lose the understanding that their greatest defense was a cultivated relationship with their environment, where every plant, animal, and ritual had a role to play in maintaining the delicate balance between bounty and ruin. This silent, sophisticated language of coexistence may be their most elusive agricultural secret, one that faded when the gods left the fields and farming became merely a business of production. While the ordered basin irrigation of Upper Egypt was a triumph of human control, the lifeblood of the Nile branched into a world of beautiful chaos at its northern end. The delta was Egypt's other face, a vast, sprawling wetland paradise where the river surrendered to the sea. Forget the neat geometric fields of the south. In antiquity, this was a labyrinth of shifting river channels, shallow lagoons, and floating islands of papyrus, a breathing, watery landscape that demanded an entirely different kind of agricultural wisdom. Here, the black land was not a narrow ribbon, but a fan of incredible fertility, a mosaic of ecosystems each offering its own bounty. The most iconic plant was papyrus, its tall, green stems forming dense, swaying thickets that were the literal raw material of civilization. But harvesting papyrus was a specialized, lost art. It wasn't simply cut down. Workers in light reed boats would venture into the marshes, selecting mature stems and slicing them near the base with a careful, angled cut to avoid damaging the root system, ensuring the plant would regrow. The stem itself was then processed with a precision we can barely reconstruct, sliced into thin strips, pounded together, and pressed to create the smooth writing surface that recorded Pharaoh's deeds. This was farming of a different sort, cultivating a renewable resource from a wild wetland. Alongside the papyrus, the delta's drier edges were the kingdom's linen factory. This is where they cultivated flax, the plant that gave them the finest linen in the ancient world. Growing flax in the delta's moist, rich soil produced fibers of exceptional length and strength. The process from plant to cloth was a symphony of specialized steps, from pulling the stalks by hand to retting them in delta lagoons, where water bacteria would gently rot away the woody parts, freeing the precious fibers within. This knowledge of water, timing, and plant handling was specific to this unique environment, but the delta was more than a cultivated garden. It was a natural larder of staggering abundance. For many who lived there, farming blended seamlessly with hunting and gathering. The marshes teemed with life, giant catfish, schools of mullet, and flocks of waterfowl so dense they could darken the sky. Scenes in tombs show nobles standing gracefully in papyrus skiffs, using throw sticks to hunt birds, or spearing fish with harpoons. For the common people, these wetlands provided a vital dietary supplement and a life less regimented than the taxed grain fields of the south. The farming techniques here were adaptations to instability. The soils were perpetually waterlogged, and channels could silt up or change course with a single large flood. How did you farm land that was half water? They likely used raised beds, piling up fertile mud to create planting mounds that stayed above the routine dampness, perfect for vegetables, fruits, and of course, more flax. They might have used woven reed mats to stabilize the banks of smaller, personal garden plots against erosion. Their tools were different, too, favoring lightweight wooden hoes and digging sticks over the heavy ox-drawn plow, which would have sunk uselessly into the soft ground. This was a fluid, adaptive agriculture, a dance with the water rather than a command of it, the knowledge of which micro-island would be stable for a season, which water plant indicated a certain fish was running, or exactly when to harvest papyrus for optimal quality, was hyperlocal, passed down in communities that lived in harmony with the marsh's rhythm. When the great cities of the Delta later rose, and drainage projects began to claim more land for conventional grain farming, this intimate, specialized relationship with the wetland world slowly faded. The techniques for thriving in that lush, tangled paradise, the secrets of the papyrus cutter and the marsh gardener, retreated into the very silt that sustained them, leaving us with only echoes of a lost, watery Eden. The Delta's fluid bounty, however, existed at the mercy of a far larger and more unpredictable force. For all their mastery, Egyptian farmers knew a terrifying truth: the Nile's perfect rhythm could falter. Their entire civilization was built on a pact with the river, and when that pact broke, survival demanded a different kind of genius, one forged in desperation. Periods of low Nile floods, what they called a bad Nile, were not mere inconveniences, they were existential crises. A flood that rose only half as high as normal meant half the land received no water, no silt, and no hope. The basins remained cracked and dry, the sun beating down on barren earth. In these times of drought, their sophisticated basin system was useless, a network of empty bowls. So what did they do? They didn't just pray. They adapted with brutal, focused pragmatism. One immediate response was emergency canal digging. If the main river channel couldn't reach the high basins, they would dig deeper, longer feeder canals to chase the receding water. A frantic human effort to extend the river's dying reach by sheer muscle and collective will. They might also shift entire planting strategies overnight, abandoning their prized emmer wheat, which required reliable moisture, and switching en masse to more drought-resistant crops like barley, or even bitter-tasting but hardy sorghum. The state's vast bureaucracy, normally a tax machine, would pivot to famine relief. Royal decrees opened the granaries, distributing stored grain from regions that had fared better, while scribes reassigned labor from monument building to well digging and emergency irrigation projects. This was crisis management on a civilizational scale, a testament to a society that could mobilize not just for glory, but for sheer survival. The ultimate test of this adaptive resilience came around 2200 BC, with a global climate catastrophe modern scientists call the 4.2 kiloyear event. For decades, perhaps even a century, the reliable summer rains in the Ethiopian highlands failed. The Nile's flood became a trickle, year after punishing year. This wasn't a single bad year, it was a new, horrifying normal. The Old Kingdom, the age of the Great Pyramid builders, crumbled under this prolonged stress. We call it a collapse, but for those who lived through it, it was a relentless, grinding battle to adapt or die. The strategies that emerged in this crucible were likely the most innovative and desperate in their history. They may have perfected techniques for harvesting every drop of dew, using specially placed stones to channel nighttime condensation into jars. They might have developed radical new forms of terracing on desert margins to capture any rare flash flood from a sudden, isolated rainstorm. Oral traditions would have fiercely guarded the knowledge of which wild, deep-rooted desert plants could be eaten in extremis. The state might have organized mass migrations of populations from the hardest-hit areas to the still fertile delta, a logistical nightmare requiring unprecedented social coordination. Surviving this epoch required a complete rewriting of the agricultural playbook, a generation that learned to farm the very edge of oblivion, and this is where the loss becomes profound. When the rains finally returned and the Nile's rhythm was restored, those hard-won crisis techniques were no longer daily necessities. The knowledge of how to coax food from a dying river, how to manage a society through decades of scarcity, became a kind of forgotten folklore, a dark art no one wished to practice. The brilliant, desperate innovations of the famine years were not inscribed on temple walls celebrating abundance. They were the painful, intimate memories of grandparents, stories of hunger and ingenuity that faded as granaries filled once more. The civilization that rebuilt itself after the 4.2 kiloyear event was different, perhaps more decentralized, certainly more wary, but it likely carried forward only fragments of that survival wisdom. The complete, holistic system for enduring a changing climate, a system written in the calluses and quick decisions of a million farmers, did not get passed down. It was a library of crisis knowledge that burned away when the sun shone again, leaving future generations vulnerable to the next great shift. Their true lost farming technique, therefore, may not be a tool or a canal, but the immense, flexible intelligence of a society that learned how not to die when the world they knew dried up and blew away. That desperate battle for survival reveals a deeper truth about Egyptian agriculture. It was never a closed system. For all its legendary self-sufficiency, Egypt was not an island. Its farmers were part of a vast, ancient network of exchange, borrowing ideas and sharing their own across deserts and seas. The flow of agricultural knowledge was a quiet, constant dialogue with the wider world, and some of their most cherished techniques may have roots far beyond the Nile. To the south lay Nubia, a land the Egyptians both traded with and conquered. From Nubia, they likely acquired new livestock breeds, hardy cattle and donkeys better adapted to arid conditions, which would have strengthened their own herds. More intriguing is the possible exchange of sorghum, a supremely drought-resistant grain that became a life-saving crop during famines. Did Nubian farmers, long accustomed to a less predictable river, teach their northern neighbors how to cultivate this resilient plant? It is a tantalizing possibility. From the Fertile Crescent to the northeast, in the lands of the Levant, came a different kind of bounty, new fruit varieties. The pomegranate, with its jewel-like seeds and tough, storing skin, is thought to have originated in Persia and been introduced to Egypt through trade with Canaan. The olive, source of precious oil, likely followed a similar path. Adopting these new crops required new knowledge, how to prune an olive tree, how to press its fruit, techniques that would have blended with Egypt's existing horticultural mastery. The exchange was not one way. Egyptian grain, the famous breadbasket surplus, was a strategic export that fed neighboring empires, but they likely sent more than just sacks of emmer wheat. The core principles of basin irrigation, the shaduf, and their calendar-based farming could have traveled with traders and diplomats. Imagine a Levantine king, impressed by Egypt's consistent harvests, sending his own engineers to study the great canals. Those engineers would not have copied a blueprint, they would have carried home the underlying concepts, adapting them to their own rivers and terraces. The knowledge was filtered, changed, and merged with local practices, so that the original Egyptian method was lost in translation even as its influence spread. Later, with the Greeks and then the Romans, the exchange became more documented but no less transformative. The Ptolemies, Greek rulers of Egypt, were fascinated by its agricultural wealth and invested heavily in reclaiming Fayum-like land. They brought Greek viticulture techniques, possibly refining Egyptian wine production. The Romans, masters of engineering, admired and expanded the Egyptian system, but with a characteristically Roman focus on efficiency and scale. They may have introduced improved metal tools, like stronger iron plowshares that could cut deeper, potentially disrupting the delicate balance of the silt-based soil. Here lies a profound irony. The more Egypt's knowledge was adopted by powerful successors, the more the original, nuanced version of that knowledge risked being overwritten. A Roman administrator might see a basin irrigation system and simply order it enlarged, missing the subtle, local cues for water distribution that Egyptian farmers had perfected over centuries. The specific, place-based wisdom, the oral traditions of silt depth and seasonal signs, had no place in a Roman ledger. So what was truly lost? Perhaps not the grand idea of irrigation, but the cultural memory of how to do it in perfect harmony with the Nile's unique personality. Egyptian agricultural genius became a global heritage, its origins blurred, its most delicate insights fading away as its robust principles conquered the world. This raises a haunting question for any technology. What is lost when a brilliant, localized adaptation is scaled into a universal standard? The exchange of knowledge with empires was a double-edged sword. As foreign rulers admired and adopted Egypt's agricultural wealth, they began to reshape its very foundations, layer by layer, until the original pharaonic blueprint faded beneath centuries of change. The Roman conquest marked the first great transformation. The Romans were brilliant engineers, but they thought like administrators, not like priests of the Nile. They saw the basin irrigation system and recognized its output, but perhaps missed its soul, the deep, seasonal symbiosis with the river's natural flood pulse. To increase efficiency and tax revenue, they introduced powerful new water-lifting technology, like the sakia. This was a giant leap from the human-powered shaduf. The sakia was a large, vertical water wheel, often turned by a blindfolded ox walking in a circle. Its rotating motion powered a chain of pots that could lift water from a canal or well continuously, day and night, and pour it into elevated channels. Its output was tremendous, allowing for the irrigation of even more land, more reliably. But this constant lifting came at a cost. It encouraged a shift away from the basin system's beautiful patience. Why wait for the annual flood to fertilize and water the land when you could just pump water onto it all year round? This began to decouple farming from the Nile's natural rhythm. Furthermore, Roman land management laws likely prioritized large, consolidated estates owned by absentee landlords, breaking apart the communal village structures that had maintained the local canals and levees for generations. The intimate, localized knowledge of how to care for a specific basin began to lose its value. The system became more productive in the short term, but also more fragile, more dependent on centralized maintenance and slave or animal labor, and crucially, more disconnected from the ecological wisdom of the pharaonic model. Then came another wave of change with the Arab agricultural revolution centuries later. This was not a conquest of erasure, but one of enthusiastic addition. New rulers introduced a glorious bounty of crops that would forever alter Egypt's landscape and diet. Cotton, with its fluffy white balls, demanded new watering schedules and processing techniques. Sugarcane required vast amounts of water and intensive labor to crush and boil into sweetness. Citrus trees, oranges, lemons, and limes brought vibrant color and sharp fragrance, but they needed careful, perennial irrigation and protection from frost. These were cash crops, destined for trade across a vast Islamic empire. To support them, the existing irrigation networks were expanded and adapted. Canals were dug deeper, new water wheels installed, and a different calendar of planting and harvest took root. The old gods of the Nile were replaced by new prayers, and the agricultural calendar now had to accommodate the needs of cotton and sugarcane alongside the ancient emmer and barley. Each new crop brought with it a suite of specialized knowledge, from how to prune a citrus tree to the exact moment to harvest cotton before the boll weevil could strike. This knowledge was vital, innovative, and prosperous, but here lies the quiet tragedy of accumulation. With each new layer of technology and each new suite of crops, the older, pharaonic layer was buried deeper. Why would a farmer in the 9th century teach his son the precise prayer to Renenutet for locust protection when he could use a new technique from Persia? Why memorize the subtle signs of a coming low Nile from the river's color when the Sakia could pull water from a deeper well anyway? The sophisticated, holistic system of the pharaohs, the integration of basin irrigation, celestial timing, spiritual practice, and community labor, was not destroyed in a single cataclysm. It was simply made obsolete, piece by piece, by newer, seemingly more productive methods. The oral traditions that held the nuanced secrets of silt depth and companion planting faded first, as the languages of power shifted from Demotic Egyptian to Greek to Arabic. The state bureaucracy no longer measured the flood for the festival of Parrot, but for tax quotas on cotton. The shaduf remained, but as a humble tool, its deeper significance as part of a sacred cycle forgotten. The Great Fayum system, once a monument to pharaonic vision, was now just a water source for new crops. The loss was not malicious, but it was profound. It was the slow replacement of a deep, localized conversation with the land by a louder, more global conversation of commerce and empire. The river still flowed, but the people listening to it heard different instructions. What remained was a palimpsest, a manuscript where the original, elegant text of pharaonic farming had been scraped away, still faintly visible beneath the bold, new writing of sugarcane and sakias, waiting for someone to decipher its forgotten language. So how do we even begin to piece together this faded palimpsest of knowledge? Our window into their lost world is not a single, clear pane of glass, but a mosaic of fragments, painstakingly assembled by archaeologists, botanists, and historians. The most vivid pieces of that mosaic come from the tombs themselves, from the very places the Egyptians prepared for eternity. In the silent darkness of a burial chamber, they painted and carved not just prayers, but the entire story of life on the Black Land. The tomb of a man named Senejum, an artisan from the village of Deir el-Medina, is a perfect example. His tomb walls are not filled with scenes of battle or grand ceremony. Instead, they show him and his wife harvesting flax, plowing with oxen, and sowing seeds. In stunning, sequential detail, it is a visual instruction manual for the afterlife, and by extension, for us. We see the exact angle of the sickle in a reaper's hand, the way the oxen are yoked to the plow, the shape of the baskets used for winnowing grain. These are not symbolic gestures, they are documentary records, created with the belief that these precise actions would need to be replicated forever. Every fold of a farmer's linen kilt, every stalk of emmer wheat, is rendered with an artisan's care, providing an irreplaceable catalog of tools, techniques, and daily rhythms. Beyond these painted manuals, the earth itself yields physical evidence. Archaeologists carefully excavating the sites of ancient villages uncover the bones of the story. We find the actual flint blades from sickles, worn smooth from countless harvests. We uncover the simple mud brick outlines of granaries and the faint, ghostly traces of field boundaries and irrigation ditches, visible from the air or as subtle discolorations in the soil. At the bottom of ancient rubbish heaps, specialists in paleobotany sift through dust to find carbonized seeds, tiny time capsules that tell us exactly which varieties of wheat, barley, lentils, and grapes they cultivated. The study of animal bones, zooarchaeology, reveals the shape of their oxen, the size of their sheep, and the evidence of selective breeding for traits like strength or milk production. A butchering mark on a bone can tell a story of diet. A worn tooth from a donkey speaks to a lifetime of hauling loads. Yet, for all these clues, the gaps in our understanding are vast and haunting. A tomb painting shows us a farmer holding a tool, but it cannot tell us the exact prayer he whispered as he worked. We can analyze the chemical composition of a seed, but we cannot hear the advice an elder gave about planting it during a year of low flood. We have the granary's blueprint, but we lack the overseer's ledger detailing how he prevented rot in the back corner of the third storage room. The physical objects are the skeleton of their agricultural system. The living tissue, the millions of daily decisions, the intuitive feel for the land, the unwritten songs that set the rhythm for grinding grain, that is the breath that left the body long ago. These sources show us the what and hint at the how, but they are utterly silent on the nuanced why that guided a farmer's hand. They give us the exquisite clock, but not the intimate, whispered understanding of its intricate, ticking heart. These silent gaps in our understanding are precisely where a new kind of detective steps into the field. Experimental archaeologists do not just study artifacts, they pick them up and use them. This is not a dry academic exercise, it is a physical conversation with the past, an attempt to answer questions that scrolls and shards cannot by getting your hands dirty in real soil. Teams of researchers and historians have taken the tools from tomb paintings and museum cases and tried to bring them back to life. In dedicated plots, they have built working shadufs using period-appropriate materials, not to admire their form, but to feel their function. The first revelation is always the sheer physicality of the work. A researcher operating a newly built shaduf quickly learns the rhythm, the precise point of balance where the counterweight does its job, and the burning strain in the shoulders and back after just an hour of lifting and swinging. This simple act quantifies the ancient farmer's day in calories burned and muscles taxed, translating a painting into a profound respect for human endurance. The experiments go further, into the harvest itself. Using exact replicas of flint-bladed sickles, teams have tried to cut stands of emmer wheat, the ancient grain that is far tougher and more unwieldy than modern varieties. The first swing is often a lesson in humility. The flint blade must be held at just the right angle, and the stalks must be grasped and cut with a specific pulling motion, or the blade skips off without severing a single stem. Through trial and error, they rediscover the lost ergonomics, the way a body must move in partnership with a stone tool. They learn that a well-made flint sickle, kept sharp, is surprisingly effective, but that reaping an entire field with one is a monumental task of patience and skill, revealing why harvest time demanded every able hand in the community. Perhaps the most evocative experiments happen with fire and grain, attempting to recreate the daily bread. Following clues from tomb scenes and surviving bread loaves from tombs, experimenters grind emmer wheat on replica saddle querns. The process is brutally slow, taking hours to produce enough coarse, gritty flour for a few loaves. Kneading the dough and baking it on the exterior of preheated pottery molds, as the Egyptians did, produces a dense, flat bread with a distinctive, smoky flavor. The taste is a direct connection, a sensory link to the past that no description can provide. But these experiments do more than just highlight the labor. They often reveal unexpected efficiencies. A well-designed shaduf, operated by a practiced team, can move more water with less fatigue than initially assumed. The flint sickle, while demanding skill, creates a cleaner cut that may have been better for the plant than a dull metal blade. The pottery mold baking method, once mastered, is incredibly fuel-efficient and fast, perfect for feeding a large household. These tangible trials peel back the layers of assumption. They show us that what looks primitive to our eyes was often a highly refined technology, the product of generations optimizing for their specific environment with the materials they had. The lost techniques were not just about brute force, they were about applied intelligence in motion, a deep knowledge written in muscle memory and shared rhythm. When an experimental baker finally produces an edible loaf from scratch using 3,000-year-old methods, that loaf is more than food. It is a fragment of resurrected wisdom, a taste of the daily miracle that sustained a civilization. That tangible taste of ancient bread, born from labor and a deep partnership with the land, leaves us with a pressing modern question. In an era of climate crisis, where water is vanishing and fertile soil is blowing away, could the lost wisdom of the Nile hold keys to our own survival? The answer lies not in copying 3,000-year-old blueprints, but in rediscovering the profound principles that made them work. Consider the Egyptian approach to water, not as a resource to be pumped and wasted, but as a sacred gift to be meticulously conserved. Their entire basin irrigation system was a giant rainwater harvesting scheme, capturing the annual flood and letting it soak deep into the earth, recharging the groundwater. They did not fight evaporation with endless pumping, they worked with it, using the soil itself as a storage medium. In a modern world where aquifers are being drained faster than they can refill, this idea of capturing and infiltrating seasonal water, of treating the landscape like a sponge, is revolutionary. It is a stark contrast to our linear model of dam, pipe, and drain. Their most powerful lesson was in soil fertility. They did not mine the earth with chemical fertilizers. They accepted an annual gift, the nutrient-rich Nile silt, and built their entire civilization on this natural renewal. They understood you cannot endlessly take from soil without giving back. Their intuitive crop rotation with legumes was a biological fertilizer factory. Today, with topsoil erosion and degradation a global emergency, their model of allowing natural systems to replenish the land, of viewing fertility as a cycle, not an input, feels urgently relevant. It argues for a shift from extraction to regeneration. Then there is their genius for adaptation. When the flood failed, they switched crops, they dug emergency wells, they mobilized society. They were not tied to a single way of farming, but to an outcome, survival. Modern monoculture, reliant on vast irrigation and specific hybrids, is incredibly vulnerable to a changing climate. The Egyptian example teaches resilience through diversity, both in crops and in strategies, having a backup plan written in the seed vault and the community network. This is not about romanticizing the past. Their system supported millions, but it was also fragile, dependent on a specific river's rhythm. We cannot and should not replicate it. But we can extract its core operating principles: water as a cyclical gift to be captured, soil as a living bank to be enriched, and agriculture as a flexible dialogue with a changing environment. We stand at a crossroads they would recognize, facing a less predictable natural world. The real lost technique we need to recover is not the shaduf, but the mindset behind it, a mindset that saw the farm not as a factory separate from nature, but as an integrated part of it. In their silent fields, they practiced a form of sustainable intelligence we are now desperately trying to reinvent with technology. Perhaps the ultimate lesson from the Black Land is the most humbling. True sustainability is not a new invention, but often a forgotten conversation waiting to be heard again. Their forgotten conversation with the land echoes across the centuries, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of a relentless sun. We have journeyed from the mighty Nile's predictable floods to the silent, sacred act of sowing seeds in its black silt. We saw the genius of the basin, a landscape turned into a sponge, and the relentless rhythm of the shaduf, a simple machine that conquered gravity drop by drop. We witnessed the state's vast machinery, from the pharaoh's surveyors measuring fields to the granaries that fed a nation, and we felt the intimate, daily magic of turning grain into the bread and beer that built pyramids. This was not a collection of random tricks. It was a coherent, brilliant system, an adaptive response sculpted over millennia to fit one river, one strip of soil, and one climate perfectly. These techniques were the unseen bedrock beneath every monument, the quiet hum that powered their civilization's dazzling achievements. Yet, as we have seen, this profound knowledge proved fragile. It was not lost in a single fire or invasion, but faded slowly, buried under new empires, new crops, and new ways of thinking. The physical canals silted up when the collective will to maintain them dissolved. The whispered wisdom of the harvest faded when the language of the gods was no longer spoken in the fields. Their story is a powerful reminder that our greatest technologies are not just tools or blueprints, they are living traditions of understanding, sustained by the societies that value them. So we leave you with this question, as you look at our own world of vertical farms and genetic engineering. Which of these lost Egyptian techniques resonated most with you? Was it the shaduf's elegant simplicity, the basin's capture of an entire flood, or the sacred partnership between the farmer and the river's rhythm? And perhaps more importantly, it invites us to look at our own time and wonder, what essential knowledge do we hold today, in our hands and in our habits, that might seem just as miraculous and just as lost to those who come after us?